Hello teacher, this is my homework about punctuation science and I'm gonna start with the period. The period is used to end a declarative sentence or imperative sentence. The period stands inside quotation marks. So it basically says that when you end a sentence, you have to add a period at the end. For example, Diego is buying a computer and at the end you add the period. Okay, so the period are also often used with abbreviation and acronyms. For example, when you abbreviate United States like US, you have to add a period. Now I'm going to explain the comma, which have many uses, so I'm going to number it because it's easier to me. Well, the first use is a comma is used to separate two independent clauses joined by any of the following coordinating conjunctions, which are and, but, for, or, and or. For example, the men remained in the kitchen, and the women went out to the garden. The second use is a comma is used to separate a dependent clause from the main clause that follows. For example, when I was through with the dishes, I sat down with a glass of wine. The third use of the comma is if the dependent clause follows the main clause, the comma is often not used. A perfect example of this would be I sat down with a glass of wine when I was through with the dishes. As you can see, there are commas. The fourth use is a comma is used to separate an introductory element from the main clause of a sentence. For example, running as fast as he could, Chris finished second in the marathon. The fifth use is a comma is used after a wide range of introductory words, including yes, no, oh, and well at the beginning of a sentence. For example, no, I can tell you why she left so suddenly. Or another example would be, well, they may stay in the guest room if they leave by tomorrow afternoon. The next use is a comma is used to separate an opposite phrase from the rest of a sentence. An opposition is a word or phrase placed after another to provide additional information about it or to explain it. For example, my game console, an Xbox, offers crystal clear graphics. The next use is a comma is used to separate declarative elements from a clause that poses a question. For example, that movie was beautiful, don't you think? Or Diego is handsome, don't you think? Um, the next use of a comma is that a comma is used to separate groups of numbers, the different elements of an address, and the day from the year. A comma ordinarily is not used to separate the name of a month from the year. For example, their 28th wedding anniversary was on March 10, 2000. The next use is a comma is used to separate interrupting elements from the rest of a sentence. For example, when John finishes his degree, which will be some kind of miracle, he plans to start his own business. The next use is when a comma is used at the end of the greeting of a personal letter and at the end of the closing. For example, dear Mr. Hernandez, and you put comma and you write your text. Or at the end, which is more like sincerely yours, and you add a comma. Perfect. Uh, the next used is a comma is used to separate numbers composed of four or more digits, but except for years. For example, we need 1,500 cubic yards of concrete for the parking lot. Okay, I think it's clear. The next use is a comma is sometimes used when the meaning of a sentence needs to be preserved and to avoid confusion. For example, she asked me why I hadn't kissed her, and jiggled to make clear that is she who jiggled. And the next use of a comma is used to separate direct quotations from the rest of a sentence. For example, the president always said, to protect our freedom, I must be conservative. The next use of the comma is when a comma is used to separate the person or persons being addressed from the rest of the sentence. Um, for example, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, may I have your attention? And the next use of a comma is when you use it to separate items in a series. For example, we bought apples, plums, and a bushel of tomatoes. Okay, I think it's easy. Now the semicolon. The semicolon is used to mark a break between independent clauses in the same sentence. Same sentence. It links clauses that are closely related. For example, she has asked them to leave several times. Semicolon. They had a habit of overstaying their welcome. A semicolon is also used before conjunctive adverbs and transitional phrases that join independent clauses. For example, they had been walking around the neighborhood for hours, looking for the lost dog, semicolon. At the same time, they talked to neighbors they had never met before. A semicolon is used also to join independent clauses connected by a coordinating conjunction, which can be and, but, for, nor, or, so, or yet, when at least one of the clauses contains comma. So the sentence have to have a comma. For example, it was time for the football team to take a break, drink some water, and stretch. But there were so many different exercises, and they had such a limited space that they will need to be on break for too long to really stretch properly. A semicolon is also used to separate a series of elements from the rest of the sentence when at least one of the elements is long and contains comma. These elements can be phrases or clauses. In his analytical thesis on the Ninth Symphony, the author decided to include information about Beethoven's father, Johann, who was his first music teacher, semicolon, Christian Gottlob Neff, his most important teacher in Bonn, semicolon, and Giulietta Guicciardi. A semicolon is also used like to place outside quotation marks. For example, Cheryl told him, you might be scared when you watch this movie. Semicolon. Still, I don't think it's scary enough to prevent you from watching it. Okay, now I'm gonna explain the colon. A colon connects clauses that are closely linked in meaning or topic. The second clause continues or develops the thought of the first clause, or it contains an illustration or explanation of a topic in the first clause. If a complete sentence follows a colon, the first word of that sentence should be capitalized. For example, Bill has 39 paintings on his wall, colon, 10 of them he painted himself. Okay, I think it's clear. Then a colon is sometimes used to introduce dialogue or formal statements. In this case, the first word after the colon is capitalized. For example, Julian could not help himself when the teacher asked him what was wrong. Colon, there is no reason for all of us to be punished because Fred won't stop acting silly in class. A colon is also used after the greeting in formal or business letters. For example, just say, Dear Mr. Hernandez, and then you add the colon and write your letter. And the colon is used also to separate hours and minutes in statements of time. Well, this is very known. For example, 7, for example, 7 colon AM, like to say the hour. The question mark. A question mark is used at the end of a sentence to signal a question. It can be a direct question, an interrogative series, or an expression of editorial doubt. For example, a very easy example, when are you coming? I think it's easy. Then the exclamation point. An exclamation point or mark is used to signal an interjection, which is often associated with fear, surprise, shock, excitement, or disbelief. An exclamation point can also be used instead of a quotation. Sorry. An exclamation point can also be used instead of a question mark to indicate that the overall emotion of a question is surprise, not interrogation. For example, very emotionated, that's amazing, or great, and are some examples of the exclamation point. Um, Now the apostrophe. An apostrophe is used in one of two ways: to form a contraction, I mean like a shorter version of two words, or to express possession. Following are some common English contractions. For example, if you want to say cannot, you say can't with the apostrophe, don't forget it. For example, do not, don't. It is, it's. What is, what's, and who is, whose. And in the same way that the apostrophe is used to replace letters that have been omitted, it can also be used to indicate that numbers have been omitted. Like, for example, to say uh, the decade of the 1960s. You only say, well, the 60s, but you have the apostrophe. When an apostrophe is used to indicate joint ownership, only the last word has the apostrophe. Like, for example, my grandmother and grandfather's paintings are in the Arctic. Or another example would be Bill and Peter's car dealership is at the next intersection. And to finish, if joint ownership is not involved, each party has an apostrophe. For example, Inst- for example, Tim and Barbara's pets. Instead of that, you can say Tim's and Barbara's pets.